Morning, Miss Kenzie. Court reporter checking in.
Good morning. Thank you for letting me know you're here.
You're welcome.
And for everyone else, I'll take a few more moments just to let everyone connect fully. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning. It is August 30th, 2022. No, it's August 31st, 2022. Excuse me. And I am Hearing Officer Nicole Kinsey with the Administrative Hearings Office of the State Water Resources Control Board. This is the surrebuttal portion of the hearing for Phase 1B on the applications of North Kern Water Storage District and City of Shafter, application 31673. City of Bakersfield, application 31674, Buena Vista Water Storage District, application 31675, Kern Water Bank Authority, application 31676, Kern County Water Agency, application 31677, and Rosedale Rio Bravo Water Storage District, application 31819, all for permits to appropriate water from the Kern River system. This portion of the hearing is being held in accordance with the notice of public hearing dated January 12th, 2022, the amended notice of public hearing dated February 9th, 2022, and the notice of additional hearing dates dated July 18th, 2022. This hearing is being conducted by Zoom web conference and is also being broadcast live on the AHO YouTube channel. Both the audio and video are being recorded, and we will post files of the recordings to the AHO FTP site. The YouTube recording will also be available on the AHO YouTube webpage. If you are experiencing technical difficulties today trying to communicate with us, please send an email to the AHO at admin.hrgoffice@waterboards.ca.gov. The AHO staff are monitoring that email inbox and can let me know. Assisting me today are the usual staff of the Administrative Hearings Office. We once again have Nicole Mullen, as well as Amy Blunk, Skylar Anderson, and Kyle Wooldridge. Ms. Mullen will be handling the screen sharing of exhibits and moving along of the slides today. So if you are a witness, you may simply ask Ms. Mullen to advance the slide when you're ready in your presentation. And attorneys, you may ask Ms. Mullen directly to bring up a particular exhibit as we proceed today. If at any time I am experiencing technical difficulties during the hearing and I'm not able to rejoin Zoom, the Zoom conference in short order, one of my staff will call a brief recess until I'm able to rejoin you. We will take breaks today, as has been our habit in the past, and mid-morning and then lunch and so forth. We will take an hour for lunch. But if any of you or your witnesses need a break, please just let me know. I also wanted to let you know in advance that we will be taking a break today from 3:30 to 4 p.m. because of a conflict in my schedule. So I wanted to let you know so that you can plan accordingly to do what you will with that half hour. I do plan to hold us to a hard stop by 5 p.m. today. At this point, I would like to move to appearances. To do that, I'm going to identify each of the entities that filed NOIs for Phase 1B of the hearing. And as I do, if you will, please unmute your microphone and state your name. And we will go in our usual order. So I will start with the City of Bakersfield.
Good morning, Ms. Kunze and staff. Colin Pierce appearing for the City of Bakersfield, and my partner Julianne Ainsley is not on this morning, but she will be covering parts of the hearing over the next few days. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Pierce. City of Shafter.
Good morning, Ms. Kunze. Patrick Scahan with Best Best and Krieger for the City of Shafter.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Scahan. North Kern Water Storage District.
Good morning, Ms. Kunze. Scott Cuney, Law Offices of Young Wooldridge on behalf of North Kern Water Storage District.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Cuney. Buena Vista Water Storage District.
Good morning, Ms. Kinsey. Ryan Becerra, Barkowitz, Chronic, and Shanahan for Buena Vista, and the district's general counsel, Isaac St. Lawrence, is here this morning as well.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Becerra and Mr. St. Lawrence. Rosedale Rio Bravo Water Storage District.
Good morning, Jennifer Spalletta for Rosedale Rio Bravo Water Storage District.
Good morning, Ms. Spalletta. Kern Delta Water District.
Good morning, Ms. Kenzie. Craig Carnes with Ellison Schneider Harrison Donlin for Kern Delta Water District, and the district's general counsel, Richard Iger, is on as well.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Carnes and Mr. Iger. Kern County Water Agency.
Good morning, Ms. Kinsey. Nick Jacobs with Somac, Simmons and Dunn, appearing on behalf of the Kern County Water Agency.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Jacobs. Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District.
Good morning, Ms. Kenzie. This is Peter Keel.
Good morning, Mr. Keel. And Kern Water Bank Authority.
Good morning, Ms. Kenzie. Kevin O'Brien of Downey Brand for Kern Water Bank Authority. With me today are my colleagues Sam Bivens and Holly Tokar, and I will ask them to introduce themselves.
Good morning, Ms. Kenzie. Sam Bivens, Downey Brand for the Kern Water Bank Authority.
Good morning, Ms. Kinsey. Holly Tokar, Downey Brand for the Kern Water Bank Authority.
Thank you. Good morning. Good morning, Mr. O'Brien, Mr. Bivens, and Ms. Tokar. And then I'm going to look to the public interest groups. Do I have Mr. Keats with us today? And finally, California Department of Fish and Wildlife. Is there anyone else who intends to participate in the hearing today who I have not called upon or has not had a chance to identify themselves? All right, let's move to, we'll briefly talk about the evidentiary objections. The AHO received surrebuttal testimony, exhibits and testimony from KWBA and Buena Vista. KWBA, Buena Vista, and Tulare Lake Basin Water Storage District filed evidentiary motions to exclude portions of the surrebuttal testimony, and I did issue a ruling late yesterday on August 30th, 2022. I realized that was late yesterday, and it might take some rearrangement of your witnesses' testimony and presentation. So I'm acknowledging that now. I'm going to check in a moment with you, Mr. O'Brien and Mr. Bivens, about whether you're ready to present your first witness. So we'll come back to that. I also just wanted to note that I am aware that there's still an outstanding motion from KWBA on a petition for reconsideration, and I will get to that. I will do that certainly before we assign deadlines for closing briefs, so that you will have that information when you're drafting your closing briefs. So I acknowledge that.
Thank you, Ms. Kenzie.
Thank you. Before I move to talk about the order of proceeding and how we will move forward today, are there any other procedural issues that we should address before we go ahead and just jump into our presentations?
Ms. Kenzie, Ryan Becerra, just to note, in response to the evidentiary ruling, Buena Vista did circulate an email about an hour ago with our determination as to what has been excluded.
Thank you, Mr. Becerra. I did see that email. I saw that it came in. We'll take a closer look at it, and then let's make sure we deal with that when KWBA offers their exhibits into evidence, hopefully later today. Do you think that makes sense?
Certainly, I do have a question as to if KWBA is proceeding with witnesses at this point, just how we manage the exclusions of evidence as those presentations occur.
Ms. Kinsey, perhaps I can help with that. I had a chance to review Mr. Becerra's proposed exhibit exclusions, and we agree with everything that he said based on your ruling letter, with one thing that we just want to clarify with you with respect to Dr. Miltenberger's testimony.
Okay.
Yeah.
Please go ahead, Ms. Tokar, if you can just describe what the one outstanding issue is.
Yeah, so as we saw, your ruling on Dr. Miltenberger's testimony excluded a series of paragraphs, and I guess at the outset, paragraph 2, you excluded lines 10 through 14, and we believe perhaps lines 10 through 12 should stay in. That covers the first topic of his testimony, which seems to have been left in.
All right, let's go ahead. I think we might as well address this now because we're probably going to get started with Dr. Miltenberger. So let's all take a moment, and I am going to find Dr. Miltenberger's testimony, and maybe Mr. Becerra and others might want to do the same, and let's address this.
And just if I could ask Ms. Tokar, just for clarification, you're talking about exhibit KWBA 38, page 2, lines 10 through 14. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And I'm specifically talking about item 1 on his summary in that paragraph.
10 through 12.
Item 1 it corresponds to paragraphs 4 through 17 of Dr. Miltenberger's testimony, which have been left in.
We have no problem with keeping that item in.
Okay, good. Thank you.
That testimony was not excluded.
It sounds like there's agreement. Thank you for this, both of you, for your clarification. So it sounds to me that in paragraph 2, the lines to be excluded should only be 12 through 14. Is that an accurate summary of what we're talking about here?
That's correct.
I'm sorry, Ms. Tokar, go ahead.
I was going to say that's correct. Only item 2 on lines 12 through 14 of paragraph 2 should be excluded.
Thank you. I will issue a correction to the ruling letter to reflect this change today.
And then I have 2 other minor points of clarification.
All right, good. We did number 1. Thank you. Please go ahead to number 2.
So paragraph 3, same issue. On lines 20 through 25, it seems that item number 1 should stay in. That's on lines 20 through 23.
Ms. Kinsey, I think there's a little bit of ambiguity there, because a portion of that of Dr. Miltenberger's testimony on that has been excluded.
Mm-hmm.
I think, however, I think probably leaving 1 in item 1 beginning on line 20 through 23. I think that because it's primarily about district lands, it is accurate to keep it in. There's a little bit of ambiguity, but I don't think that's really a problem.
And then Ms. Tokar, do you care to respond to that? Does that fit with your understanding?
That fits with my understanding. I do think it's appropriate to leave in item 1, understanding the exclusions elsewhere in Dr. Miltenberger's testimony.
Okay. So with that, I will make the correction to leave in item 1 in paragraph 3. And then Ms. Tokar, did you say you have a third matter of clarification?
Yes, one more. We understand that you've excluded paragraphs 30 through 42. And I would just like to clarify whether paragraphs 39 through 42 should be excluded. These paragraphs discuss the 1941 Stanton appraisal, which was previously submitted and accepted as KWBA 020. And the ruling letter only discusses the exclusion of the 1930s and 1940s crop reports from the Kern County Ag Commissioner's Office. And unlike those reports, the Stanton appraisal was previously accepted as an exhibit. They were discussed in Dr. House's technical memorandum that he submitted in the rebuttal phase. So we would ask that paragraphs 39 through 42 be left in.
Ms. Kinsey, if I can respond.
Please do.
I believe those should actually be excluded. They're part of a comparison by Dr. Miltenberger with the 1930s Kern County crop reports. The discussion of Stanton is a comparison with those. Dr. Miltenberger has provided a fair amount of testimony independently about the Stanton report in his case in chief. So I believe 39 through 42 should be excluded.
Thank you, Mr. Becerra.
If I could respond, Ms.
Sure,
Kinsey.
you may respond.
I don't necessarily think this is a comparison. Dr. Howes expressly called out the Stanton reports in his exhibit Buena Vista 1102 that was submitted in the rebuttal phase. And he critiqued Dr. Howes for failing to engage with that report. And here, Dr. Miltenberger responds directly to that critique.
So thank you to both of you. I think at this point, I'm not going to change my ruling on this issue. That would be really, the others were a matter of somewhat error on my part in identifying the appropriate lines that fit with the excluded testimony. I think this exclusion was intentional. So this is essentially a reconsideration. And I'm going to deny the reconsideration here. I am going to continue to exclude paragraphs 39 through 42 for the reasons identified in my ruling. Having to do with undue consumption of time. I'm aware that, as you mentioned, the Stanton report appraisal is in the record, and I am capable of reviewing that information. So I'm going to leave that ruling as is and not make any correction there for us to proceed. Ms. Tokar, is there anything else on your list?
There is nothing else on my list. We will plan to submit corrected versions of the testimony and the PowerPoint presentations sometime today with the appropriate redactions.
Thank you very much. And with that, maybe I'll look to the room again about whether there are other issues, but are you, with those clarifications, are you prepared to go forward with presenting your first witness this morning, or do you need a few minutes to gather your thoughts, as it were, to make sure that the presentation is in order based on these exclusions?
Ms. Kinsey, I think we're certainly ready to proceed with Dr. Miltenberger. There is one slide in his PowerPoint presentation that he won't be presenting on, and I think consistent with past practice, we'll just ask him to move past that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bivens. And then maybe, will you clarify for all of us? It sounds like you would start with Dr. Miltenberger, and then how do you want to proceed after that?
We'll proceed in the order of testimony that we've submitted, also consistent with our past practice. So Dr. Miltenberger, Dr. Davids, and Ms. Boyce-Bain.
Okay, thank you. Is there anything else, any other procedural matters we should address before we go forward with Dr. Miltenberger's the summary of his rebuttal testimony? All right, with that, I will turn to either Mr. Bivens or Mr. O'Brien to go ahead and call Dr. Miltenberger, if you are ready to do so.
We are. Kern Water Bank Authority calls Dr. Scott Miltenberger as its first witness.
Thank you. And oh, my screen just changed, so I lost you, Dr. Miltenberger. I saw you were there. Now I see you. All right. Good morning, Dr. Miltenberger. It's good to see you again. Will you please go ahead and raise your right hand?
Yes. Good morning, Ms. Kinsey.
Good morning. Dr. Miltenberger, do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bivens, you may proceed with Dr. Miltenberger's testimony.
You may have him state his full name for the record.
Please.
Of course. It's Scott, S-C-O-T-T, Miltenberger, M-I-L-T-E-N-B-E-R-G-E-R.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Ms. Mullen, can I preemptively ask you to pull up exhibit KWBA 57, please? And then Dr. Miltenberger, is exhibit KWBA 38 a true and correct copy of your written rebuttal testimony?
It is.
and is exhibit KWBA 57, true and correct copy of the PowerPoint summary that you submitted with your written testimony.
It is.
And once that comes up, would you please summarize your testimony for the hearing officer?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Bivens. Ms. Mullen, may we also pull up 3 additional KWBA exhibits I might need to reference in the course of my presentation? Those are KWBA 16, KWBA 39. Actually, excuse me, we won't need KWBA 39, KWBA 51. So just 16 and 51 of KWBA. Great. Thank you so much, Ms. Mullen. Good morning again, Ms. Kinsey. In my surrebuttal testimony in my presentation today, I discussed the historical significance of critical data in these proceedings. I'm not offering any technical or even legal opinions. Rather, I situate essential documents within their historical context and note deficiencies in Dr. House's historical perspective on this data. Ms. Mullen, will you please advance to slide 3? Thank you. Among those essential documents are the Thomas Means report of 1919 and Henry Barnes's report of 1920. Dr. House's work fails to appreciate the nuances and details of these studies. Privileging Means' more general assessment of alfalfa yields for the Miller and Lux Southern Division over the more specific data provided by Barnes as to cultivation within the Buttonwillow Ranch proper, those lands south of Wasco Road that today constitute the bulk of Buena Vista Water Storage District. Dr. House, as a non-historian, is also unaware of other historical sources that point to alfalfa yields, in fact, being lower. Henry Miller, president of Miller and Lux, for instance, offered an authoritative statement on yields in the Buttonwillow Ranch in 1895. Writing to the Pacific Rural Press, the premier California farm publication of the 19th century, he observed that his company, Miller and Lux, and I'll read just here with regard to alfalfa yields. After the first season, we, the company, make 2 cuttings a year and consider 2 tons to the acre each time a good yield. I contrast that with Harry Barnes's assessment of 6 tons per acre per year, a good yield. May we have the next, may we advance to slide number 5, Ms. Mullen. In his work, Dr. House likewise critically failed to engage with W.C. Hammett's analysis of available second point water and the needs of the district in the 1927 district plan. Although I'm not an engineer or a water resources professional and cannot opine as to the technical efficacy of Hammett's work, as a historian, I see the historical significance of this work as clear and cannot be understated. This analysis of available water supply and projected demand was a fundamental element of the district plan, crafted by a civil engineer with a long time involvement with Miller and Lux and an extensive knowledge of their system. Hammett's analysis helped justify approval of the proposed district, predicated on demonstrating water in sufficient quantities to serve an anticipated demand to produce profitable crops. Hammett, in his analysis, offers no range of potential diversions, but he did articulate what he saw as beyond the district's usage. Specifically, he identified quantities in 1906, 1909, and 1916 as years in which the amount available at second point, as I've highlighted here, have greatly would have greatly exceeded the needs of the district, and a large amount would have been wasted. Hammett's analysis wasn't an isolated academic exercise. There's abundant corroborating historical evidence that indicates, certainly for 1906 and 1916, that there were flows that passed well beyond Wasco Road. George Baldwin, in his engineering memorandum, called out 1906 as among those years of exceedingly high water. The Bakersfield, California, detailed the damage that those high waters did on their way towards Tulare Lake. James Ogden indicated 1906 as being among those years of heavy flow that was passed beyond what would become the district lands. The California Department of Engineering, the predecessor to the Department of Water Resources, called out 1906 and 1916 as years in which waters reached Tulare Lake. Bulletin 9 likewise called out these years and suggested that flows over 300,000 acre feet were too uncertain to be relied upon to supply lands south of Wasco Road. The water duty projections that Hammett provides are no less deserving of attention. The 2.25 acre feet projection for the district that Hammett identified was considered to be a maximum, and in fact, he contemplated it being considerably less. He accepted that 2 acre feet per acre had been sufficient to grow the types of crops that we've discussed in these proceedings thus far: alfalfa, grain, and corn. Others agreed with this assessment, or into other analyses point to this water duty. Lippincott, in his 1919 report, likewise identified 2 acre feet per acre as acceptable to some. Bulletin 9 offered up 2.3 acre feet per acre for subsequent development that included crops that hadn't been grown in the area. There's evidence that Miller and Lux likewise has accepted 2 acre feet per acre. And on this, Ms. Mullen, may we shift and take a look at KWBA 51. KWBA 51 is a copy of the 1923 stipulation that Miller and Lux filed as part of their application process for approval of the water storage district, the proposed Buena Vista Water Storage District. It recognized a phenomenon that both Dr. Littlefield and I have discussed, which is that assessments by state authorities, specifically Sidney Harding, working for the state engineer, identified the lands north of Wasco Road as being possessing of 2 insufficient water supply. Excuse me, let me put that a little more clearly, that the water supply was insufficient to serve those lands north of Wasco Road on a regular basis. And as part of approval of the district, Miller and Lux agreed to scale down their district. In doing so, they proffered this stipulation to provide a preferential right to lands south of Wasco Road, a preferential right of 2 acre feet per acre. This is evidence of a recognition on the part of Miller and Lux of what they potentially saw as what was necessary to serve those lands south of Wasco Road, and may even suggest what had been necessary thus far to grow again the types of crops that Hammett calls out in his district plan as heretofore grown. All of this is critical information to consider, critical historical evidence to consider with regard to Buena Vista's water right entitlement, and Dr. Howes doesn't consider any of it. Ms. Mullen, may we shift back to the presentation and take a look at slide number 6? Thank you very much. Now, Hammett's work, Ms. Kinsey, relates directly to your question number 4, concerning the applicability of Dr. David's methodology to Miller and Lux lands north of Wasco Road. Abundant historical evidence indicates that this area was treated differently, that the land and water use history of this area was different from the lands south of Wasco Road. I discuss this in some detail in my written rebuttal testimony, so I'll just hit the highlights here. First of all, I think it's important to appreciate that with regard to these lands, what we're really talking about is lands within Kern County. The Miller-Hagan Agreement is applicable, or as it was drafted, was applicable to lands south of the Kern County line. And with regard to that area between Wasco Road and the Kern County line, accounts such as the one on the left-hand side from Thomas Means' 1919 report made clear that these lands were used largely for grazing or wild feed. They were supplied by wild flooding. Studies around 1919, including Lippincot's own study, which Means' work contributed to, identified the presence of wells in the area, but these were largely used for stock watering. Historical evidence indicates that there was only two structures within the area, certainly circa 1919, the Goose Lake Canal and the Fowler Canal. The latter, the Fowler Canal, in Lippincot's assessment, was not properly located to irrigate the area. Barnes's field survey notes of April 1920 noted also the lack of structures for irrigation and the lack of preparation of the land for irrigation in a manner that was similar or consistent to what occurred south of Wasco Road, the absence of contour checks, for instance. He further noted it was in his words, a floodwater proposition, that a large amount of water would be needed to supply those lands north of Wasco Road. Hammett's own analyses, going back to his preliminary engineering memo in 1922, identified, or many years in his words, with little or no water that would have been available north of Wasco Road. The Philip Johnson 1925 appraisal, in examining these lands, and this appraisal, I should note, just to interrupt myself, this appraisal was a component of the district plan, that it fit in with that first unit of the district plan. The Philip Johnson appraisal took a careful look at the lands of the Southern Division for Miller and Lux. And in Johnson identified several acres, several sections of land, several townships of unimproved land, semi-desert land, and identified the lands only being irrigable by wells. The Tulare Water Company application from the 19-teens further stalled, wasn't advanced, in no small measure, perhaps because of the lack of those heavy flows necessary to supply these lands. The Water Commission, as I discussed in my case in chief testimony, had denied the Tulare Water Company application initially because they believed those flows would only be available in exceedingly high water years. These lands ultimately weren't included in the district, and this is a very important historical point. They weren't included in the district not only because of the water supply, the lack of water necessary to make these lands productive in the same manner of the lands south of Wasco Road, but also because of the poor soil quality. This is a point that was first recognized by Cindy Harding and that Dr. Littlefield and I both discuss. Now, because of these circumstances, to assure the south of Wasco Road lands of a water supply sufficient to satisfy the requirements of the district, we have the stipulation from 1923. Looking back, Hammett in the district plan projected 2.25 acre feet as the maximum that would be necessary. And in that same month, the 1927 quitclaim identified that lands of Wasco Road would only receive water surplus after all district requirements were met. Miss Mullen, we actually bring up KWBA 16 because I want to illustrate some of the lands that we're talking about, Ms. Kinsey. Would you please pull up page 7? Thank you, Ms. Mullen. Ms. Kinsey, we've seen this map before. This is the map of the proposed Buena Vista Water Storage District. What's outlined in the thick black lines is the initial proposal, the lands initially proposed to be included. The lands that are outlined with the colors, or should be shaded in the colors, are the lands that ultimately were included in the district the district plan. What I'll note is the lands north of Wasco Road extend all the way up to the Kern County line. That's towards the very top of this map. There was one discontiguous piece that was permitted to stay within the district plan of 1927, and that's the Fowler Tract. That's that roughly rectangular shape towards the top of the map, Ms. Kinsey, approximately 2,700 acres. And these were lands that were supplied with water when it was available through the Fowler Canal. As Harding discusses in his oral history, these lands, this portion was largely brought in to save face for J. Leroy Nickel to justify the cost and expense of constructing canal works to the north. But the Fowler Tract itself ultimately was excluded. It was excluded at the request of Miller and Lux because in the words of the application, the words of the resolution that Buena Vista adopted excluding these lands in 1929, it was lands that wouldn't be benefited by district irrigation, district reclamation, or drainage water. The Fowler Tract, in my view, Ms. Kinsey, forms a kind of coda to lands north of Wasco Road. And this entire history suggests just how different the lands of this area were compared to lands south of Wasco Road. And from a historical perspective, suggests that Dr. David's methodology vastly different. It's not really applicable to this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Miltenberger. I think it makes sense. It's a little early, but we'll maybe give you a moment, Dr. Miltenberger. Let's go ahead and take 5 minutes. And then I assume, Mr. Becerra, you're going to have questions for Dr. Miltenberger.
I do.
Yes. So let's go ahead and take 5 minutes. We'll be back at 9:43 and we'll proceed with cross-examination. Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll get started as soon as I see Dr. Miltenberger has rejoined us. All right, it looks like we are back. Dr. Miltenberger, you're now off mute, so we're ready to go. I will turn things over to you, Mr. Becerra. You may ask your cross-examination questions of Dr. Miltenberger.
Thank you. Good morning, Dr. Miltenberger.
Good morning, Mr. Becerra.
Ms. Mullen, could we please pull up exhibit Buena Vista 1500? It was posted to the private FTP site yesterday.
That might help. Thank you for that clarification.
Dr. Miltenberger, do you see that this is your exhibit KWBA 39 with highlights? And please feel free to scroll through it if you like.
May we scroll down a bit more, Ms. Mullen, please? Is there another page, Ms. Mullen? Yes, I see that. I see that. Thank you, Ms. Mullen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miltenberger. Dr. Miltenberger, this was an 1895 article by Henry Miller himself, correct?
Correct.
And it was published in the Pacific Rural Press. Is that accurate?
Yes.
And I'm sorry, we didn't hear your response.
Oh, yes, it was published in the Pacific Rural Press.
And do you consider that publication to have been the premier California farm publication of the era?
I do.
Was that publication circulated statewide?
I'm not certain of its precise circulation. I believe it was largely statewide, but I don't know all the counties and cities in which it might have appeared.
Okay, thank you. Do you believe that this article entitled "The Stockyard" refers to how alfalfa was being farmed in what is now Buena Vista Water Storage District?
Well, certainly within the Button Willow Ranch portion of the district, yes.
It doesn't refer to the Button Willow Ranch, does it?
I'm sorry, Ms. Becerra, there was a little glitch in the would you please repeat that?
Yes. The article does not refer to the Button Willow Ranch, does it?
No, but there's contextual information there that points to it being this location.
And why do you believe this article refers to the Button Willow Ranch?
Well, that's based on my understanding of what Miller and Lux's ownership was within Kern County. References to watering and the acreage that he provides here is 20,000 acres of alfalfa, which corresponds with Carl Grunsky's assessment of in 1898 of the approximate amount of acreage between the east side and west side canals within the Button Willow service area. or between the Buttonwillow Ranch, what will become known as Buttonwillow Ranch property.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, can we please scroll down to the 6th highlighted passage on this page? It begins after the first season. Dr. Meltenberger, did you see that highlighted passage?
Yes.
In your opinion, does that passage suggest that annual alfalfa yields within what is now Buena Vista were less than 6 tons per acre?
I see it as historical evidence indicative of that phenomenon.
In that highlighted passage, and let me go back, is that based on the statement about 2 tons per acre and 2 cuttings?
Yes.
Do you see the next sentence that begins for hay?
Yes.
Do you see that in that sentence, Mr. Miller referred to a first crop and a second crop?
Yes.
And after the second crop, he uses the words "and any later ones." Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you know whether Miller and Lux ever had more than 2 cuttings of alfalfa per season, circa 1895?
So could you repeat that again? There was a little bit of a glitch in the video. And
Circa 1895, do you know whether Miller and Lux ever had more than 2 cuttings of alfalfa in a growing season?
I don't.
And I'm sorry, I think you were taking a sip there.
My apologies. The evidence I have is this, and I believe to answer your question is I don't.
You, just to confirm, you don't have any evidence about whether Miller and Lux had more than 2 cuttings of alfalfa per year circa 1895. Is that accurate?
That's accurate. No source comes to mind.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, can we please go to Dr. Miltenberger's testimony, KWBA 38? And can we please go to page 6, paragraph 12? Dr. Miltenberger, in this paragraph, you discuss the alfalfa farming practices of the Carmel Cattle Company. Is that right?
I discussed Barnes's account of Carmel's practices.
Was Carmel Cattle essentially a neighbor of Miller and Lux in the Buttonwillow area?
Yes.
And on lines 14 to 15, you discuss how Carmel Cattle would have had 4 or 5 cuttings of alfalfa in a season. Is that right?
Yes, and just to place that in context, Barnes suggests that yield was attributable to Carmel pasturing some of its lands.
The average yield, the 6 tons, you believe that included pasturing? Is that right?
No, I think what I'm saying is that Carmel could achieve something like that by pasturing some of its land. So I guess maybe would you please ask the question again? I think I got a little confused as to what you were asking.
Sure.
My apologies.
So on lines 14 through 16, you discuss Carmel Cattle having 4 to 5 cuttings per season, correct?
Correct, with 3 irrigations.
and they did not pasture some of their lands. Is that right?
I might express it more affirmatively and say they pastured some of their lands. Just to be fair to the record, the source.
Well, I'm looking at your testimony here on lines 14 and 15. It says, Barnes suggested that this yield was attributable to Carmel eschewing pasturing of some of its lands.
Oh, excuse me. Yes.
So they only didn't pasture some of their lands. Is that right?
That's correct.
And in this way, they got 4 or 5 cuttings of alfalfa per year. Is that right?
Yes.
And they obtained a yield of 6 tons per acre in this way?
An average yield. Yes.
Average yield. To the best of your knowledge, is it possible to know how much per acre livestock ate on the fields when the fields were pastured?
I don't have any historical information on that point, and any kind of analysis of animal consumption is beyond my expertise.
Any alfalfa that livestock ate would have been in addition to the yield achieved by cuttings. Is that right?
I don't know.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, can we please go back to exhibit Buena Vista 1500? And can we please scroll up to the 3rd highlighted passage? It begins, we put stock. Do you see that sentence, Dr. Miltenberger?
Yes.
That sentence indicates Miller and Lux was seeking to use its alfalfa lands as much as possible, correct? Let me rephrase that. That's a bad question. That sentence indicates that Miller and Lux was seeking to maximize alfalfa yield by either crops or pasture. Is that right?
I don't read the sentence that way.
Says the sentence states the only rest the land receives is when it's being irrigated. Do you see that?
I see that phrase as part of the larger sentence. Yes.
And that would mean Miller and Lux was either growing alfalfa or pasturing livestock on it, except when irrigation was occurring. Is that right?
I don't know if I can conclude that just from this sentence. I mean, I think he's generally characterizing how they're utilizing the land, but I couldn't say that. I couldn't agree with that based solely on this sentence.
To the best of your knowledge, is it possible to know what the effective alfalfa yield per acre was via pasturing on Miller and Lux's lands?
I'm an historian. I'd rely on historical accounts to indicate that. It's beyond my expertise to determine that in the absence of historical evidence.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Mullen, can we please scroll down to the 7th highlighted passage, which begins, the hay we never put. Dr. Miltenberger, do you see in this passage, Mr. Miller states that they store their hay, quote, as dry as possible?
Could you direct me a little further? I'm not quite seeing that.
Sure. Well, I'll read the sentence. The hay we never put in barns, but stacked in small, narrow row ricks to avoid danger of heating, endeavoring to get it in the rick as dry as possible. Do you see that?
I do.
So is it fair to say in that sense, Mr. Miller says that they stored their hay as dry as possible?
Yes, to avoid the danger of heating.
Do you know whether cut alfalfa weighs less when it's drier?
I don't know. I don't have knowledge of that.
Is it possible that Mr. Miller's statements about getting 2 tons per acre from its cuttings referred to dry alfalfa?
Objection calls for speculation.
I'm going to sustain the objection, and I think, well, you can go ahead, Mr. Becerra, but I think I understand the point. I don't want to go too
Dr.
far down
Milton,
the rabbit hole. Please go ahead.
I'm sorry, Ms. Kinsey.
To you, go ahead.
Dr. Miltenberger, do you have any technical qualifications of alfalfa when it's dry versus wet?
And I'm sorry, I think there was a little blip out there and I didn't catch the question. So if we could repeat
I'm
that.
sorry. Dr. Miltenberger, do you have patients to wait it's dry
Pause.
or wet?
Let's pause for a moment there. Mr. Becerra, sorry, we're having a little problem with the audio. Let's just, I think, maybe wait a second, and then you will be asked, I'll ask you to try again. All right, we'll
My
see. I think it's a
apologies.
Zoom issue because it seems to be happening, people in multiple places. All right, Mr. Becerra, to you, let's try one more time.
Thank you. Dr. Miltenberger, do you have any technical qualifications to understand the weight of alfalfa when it's dry or wet?
I'm not really certain what you mean by technical qualifications in relation to hay, but I alfalfa, but I don't have I would need, as an historian, a document or a source that would provide that information. I couldn't tell you on the fly or make some kind of calculation as I sit here. That is beyond my expertise.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, can we go to the top of the document to the first highlighted passage? Dr. Miltenberger, do you see Mr. Miller's statement? The depth at which well water is found varies from 10 to 40 feet.
I do.
That passage indicates that as of 1895, Miller and Lux was using groundwater to irrigate alfalfa, correct?
I wouldn't make that conclusion.
You would not conclude that Mr. Miller's reference to well water at depth and with irrigation does not indicate they were using groundwater for alfalfa?
I wouldn't say that based upon solely this statement here, particularly as, and I can see glancing further down, about his emphasis about irrigating from streams. I couldn't conclude is what I'm saying about the well water. And we have other evidence which suggests that that wasn't really the case. But I do note in here that he talks about irrigating from streams.
Do you note in the first highlighted passage, he refers to well water at depth?
That is written there, yes.
And is it your opinion that this article refers to the cultivation of alfalfa in the button willow area?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, can we go down to the sixth highlighted passage, which begins after the first season? Actually, you've got it on the screen, but Dr. Miltenberger, do you see the passage that begins without irrigation?
I do, yes.
You see at the end, Mr. Miller stated, when we plant, we usually select such land as can be put under a perfect system of irrigation before using.
I see that, yes.
Do you know what Mr. Miller meant by a perfect system of irrigation?
Not offhand, no.
Is it fair to say that having a perfect system of irrigation would have involved some kind of plan?
What really depends on kind of what he's getting at here under a perfect system of irrigation. I don't see this alone out of context, isolated, as necessarily indicative of a plan per se.
Okay. Ms. Mullen, can we please scroll down to the 8th highlighted passage, which begins the average price? I'll read that sentence for the record. The average price per ton for hay in our San Francisco market is about $8 to $10. Do you see that, Dr. Miltenberger?
Yes.
That sentence shows that as of 1895, Mr. Miller knew the commodity price of alfalfa in San Francisco, correct?
Correct.
Is it possible Miller and Lux was selling its alfalfa hay as a commodity as of 1895?
It's possible.
And I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear the answer. I apologize.
No, it seems like we're having issues here. My answer was, it's possible.
Thank you. You previously testified about your investigation in the Miller and Lux collection, the Bancroft Library. Is that right?
Yes.
And you testified that identified no pre-1914 plan by Miller and Lux to use lands in Buena Vista beyond livestock and meat packing. Is that right?
I think that simplifies my testimony. What I believe I testified on was that I found no plan to reorient the lands away from supporting their livestock and meatpacking operation.
And you have presented no testimony about the possibility of Miller and Lux selling its alfalfa hay as a commodity, correct?
That's correct.
Can we please go back to Dr. Miltenberger's testimony, exhibit KWBA 38? And can we please go to page 4 and paragraph 7? Dr. Miltenberger, in paragraphs 7 through 9, you discuss the alfalfa yield estimates in the Lippincott means report. Is that right?
I specifically discussed them with reference to means' separate attached report.
And 8 tons per acre for alfalfa was at the high end of estimated alfalfa yields in that report, right?
That's correct. A report that, as I note here, encompassed Miller and Lux's Southern Division, which took in lands in addition to the ones that later became part of Buena Vista.
And the Southern Division was approximately 160,000 acres. Is that accurate?
According to means' assessment, yes.
Ms. Mullen, can we please scroll down to page 5 in paragraph 9? Dr. Miltenberger, in that paragraph, you discuss Miller and Lux's alfalfa production on something called the Hubbard Ranch. Is that right?
That's correct.
Is it your opinion that the high estimate of 8 tons per acre referred to alfalfa grown specifically on the Hubbard Ranch?
I don't believe I testified that sharply on it. I'd rely on what I say here, that means' observation suggests that the higher alfalfa yields, such an observation suggests that the higher alfalfa yields reported by means may have been more indicative of yields specific to Hubbard Ranch with a year-round groundwater supply.
So it's not your opinion that that 8 tons per acre specifically came from the Hubbard Ranch?
My testimony is that there's reason to think that these large yield numbers would have occurred elsewhere in the Southern Division.
Elsewhere relative to what?
Relative to Buttonwillow, the Buttonwillow Ranch area.
Do you know whether there were only 150 irrigated lake acres on the Hubbard Ranch?
I believe that means discusses well, he certainly identifies the acreages of these properties. But as I sit here, I don't recall a specific number.
Ms. Mullen, can we please Burger's Exhibit K1?
I'm sorry, Mr. Becerra, you at least cut out for me. Can you say the exhibit number again?
Yes, KWBA 31.
Thank you.
And Ms. Mullen, can you please scroll down until we see the title page of the document? I forget which page. My apologies. Oh, can we go back up to page 2? I think that was it. Dr. Miltenberger, this is an appraisal from 1925, is that right?
That's correct.
And you've made this an exhibit?
Yes.
Is that accurate? And it's an appraisal of Miller and Lux's lands in California, is that right?
I believe, if memory's, yes.
Ms. Mullen, can we go to page 2? Is this page 2? I'm losing resolution on the screen.
Unfortunately, as am I. Yes. To answer your question, yes.
And Ms. Mullen, can we go to PDF page 11, please? Dr. Miltenberger, do you see that this page of the appraisal refers to the Hubbard Ranch?
And let's pause just for a moment. I certainly need to zoom in if you would please, Ms. Mullen. Thank you. Go ahead. I don't know if you need to hear the question again, Mr. Miltenberger.
Mr. Becerra, would you please?
Absolutely. Dr. Miltenberger, this page of the appraisal refers to the Hubbard Ranch, correct?
Correct.
And do you see that it refers to 150 acres being irrigated?
I see it says 150 acres irrigated by well water as of the date of the appraisal.
And it refers to 300 acres as being rough leveled. Is that right?
Yes.
And it refers to another 350 acres as uncleared of brush and cottonwood trees, correct?
Correct.
And do you see it refers to 90 acres of alfalfa being grown on the Hubbard Ranch?
Yes.
Is it your opinion that the high estimate of 8 tons per acre for alfalfa is specifically from the 90 acres of alfalfa grown on the Hubbard Ranch?
Objection asked and answered.
I'm sorry. Somebody said something?
Yes, objection asked and answered.
Who's that objecting? Oh, Mr. Bivens?
Yes.
Thank you.
Let's go ahead and just overruled. You may respond.
I'll
Mr.
re-ask
Miltenberger.
the question.
Thank you.
Dr. Miltenberger, is it your opinion that the Lippincott Means report's high estimate of 8 tons per acre for alfalfa is specifically from the 90 irrigated acres of alfalfa on the Hubbard Ranch?
we're mixing potentially apples and oranges here, in as much as this is a 1925 appraisal divorced in time by 6 years from the means assessment in 1919. I don't think based on this that I would necessarily apply it to means. I wouldn't draw that, given the temporal space between them.
Is it your opinion that this appraisal shows that more than 150 acres total was irrigated on the Hubbard Ranch?
This appraisal in 1925 shows that, calls that out. My point in my analysis and discussion about the Hubbard Ranch was means in 1919 was taking a look at the entire Southern Division. And I raised the Hubbard Ranch because means called it out as the most productive.
Okay. And the Hubbard Ranch's irrigated acres were 150 irrigated acres in the total Southern Division of 160,000 acres, correct?
As noted in 1925.
Okay, thank you. Can we please pull up exhibit KWBA 20, which is the Stanton appraisal? And can we please go to PDF page 28? Dr. Miltenberger, this is your exhibit, correct?
Yes, this is the Stanton appraisal.
And table 1 shows that in the 1930s, alfalfa yields reached 7.9 tons per acre within Buena Vista. Is that right?
That's what Buena Vista reported to the District Securities Commission.
Do you know whether Kern Water Bank Authority has made Buena Vista's reports to the District Securities Exchange Commission exhibits in this hearing?
I'm sorry, I'm a little, are you referring to the District Securities Commission or another filing?
Let me re-ask the question. Do you know whether Kern Water Bank Authority made Buena Vista's reports to the District Securities Commission an exhibit in this hearing?
I'm going to object on grounds of relevance and the fact that the record speaks for itself.
Mr. Becerra, do you care to respond to that?
Yes, Dr. Miltenberger made a point of saying that Buena Vista reported this information to the commission. I want to identify the relevance of that statement.
Well, I'm not sure whether the document has been submitted as an exhibit by Kern Water Bank Authority or any other entity in this proceeding.
I'll represent it has. It's exhibit KWBA 218.
I agree. My question is why it matters.
Okay, let me ask a question.
Try again. Thank
Dr.
you.
Miltenberger, do you believe that the fact Buena Vista reported this information to the District Securities Commission makes it less reliable than some other source of information?
I don't believe I wouldn't make that claim. Rather, what I would say as an historian is that any of these documents, I would need to place in their historical context, understand the reasoning behind them to the extent that I could, the circumstances that gave rise to them. There's a lot of embedded assumptions, I think, in that question that I think I wouldn't necessarily accept wholesale.
Okay. And on this exhibit, KWBA 20, on table 1, Mr. Stanton reported Buena Vista's average alfalfa yield per acre as 7.9. in at least 2 years in the 1930s. Is that right?
7.9 is listed on this table. And then
That's very close to 8. I'm sorry, I talked over you. 7.9 is very close to 8 tons per acre. Is that right?
Yes.
And as of 1919 and the Lippincott report, what is now Buena Vista's Buttonwillow service area constituted about 50,000 acres of Miller and Lux's Southern Division. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes, is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Can we go back to Dr. Miltenberger's testimony, exhibit KWBA 38? And page 22, paragraph 45. And Dr. Miltenberger, in paragraphs 45 through 59, you discuss what you call the 1927 district plan. Is that right?
I think specifically I'm discussing Hammett's analysis from the district plan.
Okay, you read my mind. That was my next question. So I'm going to refer to that plan as the Hammett report, just for clarity. Do you understand that?
I do.
And Mr. Hammett prepared that report after the state engineer had rejected a previous proposal for Buena Vista's organization, correct?
Correct.
And the previous proposal had been rejected because the water supplies wouldn't have been reliable enough for some lands. Is that accurate?
That's accurate in part.
Okay.
The other part
is,
I'm sorry, just to finish.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
My apologies. The other part is the soil quality was identified as being deficient.
Thank you. So here on your testimony on lines 13 through 14, you say that as a historian, you cannot evaluate the technical quality of Hammett's work. Is that right?
Yes.
What do you mean by technical quality in that statement?
I think the meaning I was attempting to capture was I can't evaluate it as an engineer would, as a water resources professional might.
So you would not be qualified to assess the quality of Hammett's technical discussion of crop duties. Is that accurate?
Well, I wouldn't be in a position to assess whether he's right or wrong. But I am in a position as an historian to say why it's important to consider it.
Okay, thank you. And so you would not be qualified to assess the technical quality of Hammett's analysis of water availability, correct?
Yes, how he arrived at those figures, how he made the necessary corrections as he identifies it, or the elimination of the waste component. I don't know how he did that.
Okay. And you're not technically qualified to assess that report's discussion of Buena Vista's projected water uses. Is that right?
Again, not as an engineer would, but as an historian, noting the importance of this plan to the subsequent development of the district.
Can we please pull up Dr. Miltenberger's PowerPoint KWBA 57 and go to slide 5? Dr. Miltenberger, the right-hand passage is from the Hammett report. Is that right?
That's right.
Yes?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And is it your opinion that Mr. Hammett used a crop water duty of 2.25 acre feet per acre as a basis for his analysis?
Well, I would just note here for reference is that, yes, he says that due to the uncertainty of future development, the duty of water has been fixed for the purposes of this study at 2.25 acre feet per acre.
And do you believe this is historical context that Dr. Howes failed to consider?
Yes.
In your right-hand passage, do you see the statement, the duty of water has been fixed for the purposes of this study at 2.25 acre feet per acre net use on the land?
Yes.
Do you know what the phrase net use on the land means?
I do not know what it means in this context. Again, my point is merely that this is vital historical information, evidence that Dr. Howes just simply didn't engage with.
Do you know whether net use on the land means a crop's actual uptake of water?
I think an agronomist or a water resources engineer would be best positioned to opine on this, and frankly be the kind of analysis that I would have anticipated Dr. Howes to do to arrive at his figures.
Thank you. Do you understand what 2.25 acre feet per acre net use means relative to applied water to a field?
That's a question that's beyond my expertise as a historian to answer. I would just say again that all my purpose is identifying the historical importance of this information and noting that Dr. Howes did not engage with it, whether to critique it, accept it, or do anything with it. And it's fundamental to the district as it proceeded.
So do you have any idea what the net use of water on land means relative to diversions by a water district?
Again, I think that would require a water resources professional to discuss. And I'll say that this kind of engagement with this source is exactly the kind of engagement that I think Dr. Howes did not provide and is critically lacking in his analysis. Speaking as an
Do you have any idea whether net use of 2.25 acre feet per acre is a reasonable technical number?
Objection asked and answered.
Sustained. Mr. Becerra, I think we can move on if you would please from this line of questioning.
Thank you very much. Can we please pull up exhibit KWBA 38, page 27? And go to paragraph 57. You discussed the Lippincott means report here, correct?
In paragraph 27?
57.
57, excuse me. Yes, it's one of the things I discussed in paragraph 57.
And you discussed this report as stating a duty of water of 2.5 acre feet per acre annually, correct?
Yes, that for the purposes of the report, they assumed that water duty.
Okay. Ms. Mullen, can we please do you know whether there was any technical analysis to support that assumption in the Lippincott means report?
Well, the Lippincott means report is very detailed, and I recall that it included a number of tables and references to figures. I'd have to refresh my memory with specific reference to it, but given the depth of work that seems to have been done, I would presume that without reference to the document, as I sit here, that there was a manner of analysis that was performed, much as Hammett would have analysis.
Apologize.
Oh, I'm sorry, if this got cut off for the core reporter, I would just say, or what I was saying in conclusion was, without reference to the specific document, I can't be sure, but I would presume, given my recollection of it, that there was, much as Hammett would have performed an analysis as well.
Ms. Mullen, can we please pull up exhibit KWBA 30? And for the record, Dr. Miltenberger, this is the Lippincott means report, correct?
Correct.
Ms. Mullen, can we please go to PDF page 74? And scroll down. Thank you. Dr. Miltenberger, do you see on this page the section entitled Duty of Water?
Yes.
And lower in the paragraph, there's the reference to 2.5 feet of water will permit 5 irrigations. Do you see that?
I do.
Is that sentence the basis for your inclusion of 2.5 acre feet per acre as projected need in your testimony?
I believe my specific quote is actually to the topic sentence.
Okay. Thank you for the clarification. Do you see in towards the bottom of what's currently on the screen, the sentence, it will be more than required for grain and less than required for alfalfa?
Yes.
Is it fair to say the Lippincott means report identified that some crops might require more than 2.5 acre feet per acre?
That sentence suggests that, yes.
Do you know whether that's net water use or applied water?
Objection, vague and ambiguous. We haven't even established that Dr. Miltenberger believes there's a distinction.
I think, well, and what the definitions are. So I think that's fair, Mr. Becerra. If we want to go this way, would you please break down the question?
Sure. Do you understand net consumed by a?
And I'm sorry, Mr.
Sorry.
Becerra, you broke up again. So let's pause a moment and we'll let Zoom do what it does.
Thank you.
And then let's try again, please. Go ahead.
In this passage, Dr. Miltenberger means we're.
And I'm sorry, Mr. Becerra, we're having another blip. So let's maybe what we'll do is we'll take.
Yeah, what?
We're about ready for a break, and maybe we can take a break.
Yes.
It could be that if you reestablish your connection, maybe that will help. I'm not sure. So I apologize for that. Let's go ahead and take 10 minutes. We'll come back at 10:43.
Ms. Kenzie, we may, with these glitches on the Zoom, just ask everyone who's not the four of us here on screen to go on mute. Sometimes that can help if there are with the glitch issues.
Certainly, if there is anyone else who is other than the four of us who is not on mute, please double check that you are on mute. That may help.
Mr. Becerra, did you get to reboot? Because I'm pretty sure it's entirely coming from your end.
We have tried to sort out our gremlins.
Okay.
We stopped feeding them after midnight.
Oh, that's a good plan.
Well, let's, so with that request of everyone, let's give it another shot, Mr. Becerra. And if we have problems, we can take the time we need to work it out. Zoom has its downsides, although it's really quite a bit more convenient than anything else. So, Mr. Becerra, I will turn things back to you.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, can you please pull up exhibit KWBA 100? Dr. Miltenberger, do you see that this is Dr. David's testimony?
Ms. Mullen, may we scroll down just a little bit? Yes, I do, Mr. Becerra.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, can we please go to PDF page 28 and paragraph 73? Dr. Miltenberger, do you see on lines 17 and 18, Dr. Davids describes the relationship between crop consumption of applied water and applied water?
Well, I must confess that I can read the English. I'm not certain. I don't have the expertise to fully appreciate the point perhaps here.
So you don't have the technical qualifications to know the difference between crop consumption and applied water. Is that right?
That's not my realm of expertise, no.
Ms. Mullen, can we please go back to exhibit KWBA 30? And Dr. Miltenberger, do you see that we're still discussing the duty of water section in this exhibit?
Yes.
And for purposes of the record, this is PDF page 74. So Dr. Miltenberger, you don't have the qualifications to know when this page refers to a duty of water of 2.5 feet per acre, whether that's crop consumption or applied water?
Objection, misstates testimony.
If you would please rephrase the question, Mr. Becerra. Let's try again.
Sure. Dr. Miltenberger, when this report refers to a quote, duty of 2.5 feet on the lands irrigated, do you know what that means technically?
I think I have an informed layperson's understanding of what a duty of water is, but I don't know to a specific question about net applied. I don't know.
Okay, thank you very much. Can we please go back to Dr. Miltenberger's testimony, KWBA 38, and go to page 27? And Dr. Miltenberger, do you see paragraph 57 there at the bottom?
Yes.
And Ms. Mullen, can you please scroll to the next page? There on lines 1 through 4, Dr. Miltenberger, you discussed bulletin 9, is that right?
That's right.
And you cite it as supporting a estimated 2.3 acre feet per acre as an average for several crops. You see that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And you cite PDF page 197 out of bulletin 9 for that purpose, correct?
Correct.
Ms. Mullen, can we please pull up exhibit KWBA 14? And Dr. Miltenberger, do you recognize this as your copy of bulletin 9?
Yes.
Ms. Mullen, can we please go to PDF page 197? And Dr. Miltenberger, do you see that this is document page 188?
Yes.
And do you understand the heading area now using second point water to mean areas that are now within Buena Vista?
Yes.
Is the table on this page your source for your citation of an average duty of 2.3 acre feet per acre?
Ms. Mullen, may we please blow up that table? Yes, thank you. It is, yes.
Okay. Ms. Mullen, can we please go to PDF page 193, which is document page 184? Dr. Miltenberger, do you see that this is the first page of chapter 9 entitled Extent of Feasible Irrigation Development?
Yes.
That table we just referenced is contained in this chapter, correct?
I believe that's correct, yes.
In the paragraph immediately following the chapter title, do you see the sentence that begins with a water supply regulated by storage?
Yes.
Is it fair to say this chapter projects potential water demands in a storage regulated system?
I think generally that's correct. There's some particulars.
Do you see the sentence that says with a regulated supply, quote, present practices in the use of water can be modified?
Yes.
Does that indicate that the crop duty of 2.3 acre feet per acre you cited is a projection of potential conditions?
Yes, and that appears in my rebuttal testimony.
Okay. Can we, Ms. Mull, can we go down further, please, so we can see the whole paragraph that begins alfalfa is used? Dr. Miltenberger, do you see about halfway through that paragraph, there's a sentence that begins the results of the canvass?
Yes.
Does that indicate to you that the state did a survey of alfalfa growers to support Bulletin 9?
I would need a little bit more information to make that conclusion. I'm aware from Bulletin 9 that there was an investigation about groundwater development, and this has been discussed previously in these proceedings. I don't know if it's specific for alfalfa growers or if it's a little more nuanced than that. That's a connection made to alfalfa growers relative to this canvas of pumping plants.
Do you see that sentence refers to the canvas of pumping plants as indicating that an average of 4.9 acre feet per acre north of the river was pumped for alfalfa?
I recognize that paraphrase as being accurate.
Buena Vista's Button Willow service area is located north of the Kern River, isn't it?
Yes.
So this portion of Bulletin 9 indicates that the state's canvas found that for groundwater pumpers, they were applying 4.9 acre feet per acre to grow alfalfa. Is that right?
North of the river, and I should just say for the record, Ms. Kinsey, to qualify this, again, Bulletin 9 was a study of the entire Kern River Basin. So we're potentially talking about lands both within the Button Willow service area and outside of it. I mean, the whole purpose of Bulletin 9 was to articulate a plan for the full water resources development of the basin, the proposal to create a central district that didn't happen and was in large part predicated upon the construction of Isabella Reservoir to a specified extent. I can't recall the specific, capacity. So I think that's important context when we're reading through this to appreciate.
Just to confirm, this page of Bulletin 9 indicates that for groundwater pumpers, the state found they were using 4.9 acre feet per acre north of the river to grow alfalfa. Is that right?
I mean, the sentence is, as I've agreed to, that it provides that information. But again, we can't isolate that information in the broader context. And I think we have to be mindful of the fact that Bulletin 9 is both specific to certain areas and then more broadly discussing the basin and its developmental possibilities and the conditions as of 1920.
You see the next sentence that begins, while these averages?
I see that sentence, yes.
Is it fair to summarize that sentence as stating the average level of efficiency was, quote, much better for groundwater pumpers than areas irrigated with ditches?
Objection, vague and ambiguous as to efficiency.
I can restate.
Okay, please.
Do you see that sentence, Dr. Miltenberger? It states the present average standard of land preparation and handling and care of water, unquote, is much better for groundwater pumpers than areas irrigated with ditches. Is that accurate?
I'm sorry, Ms. Becerra, I needed to read the question in full. The sentence in full. Would you please repeat your question?
Sure. Is it fair to summarize that sentence as saying the care and handling of water at the time was much higher for those pumping groundwater than those relying on ditches?
I mean, I'd rely on the text and say that the present average standard.
Okay. As of 1920, the current Buena Vista service area was being irrigated with surface water through ditches primarily, correct?
Correct.
Does this portion of Bulletin 9 suggest that more than 4.9 acre feet per acre was being applied for alfalfa within what's now Buena Vista?
I'm not certain I can answer that question solely from this.
Okay, thank you. Can we please go back to Dr. Miltenberger's testimony, exhibit KWBA 38? And go to page 26. And paragraph 54.
To summarize, in paragraph 54, Dr. Miltenberger, you critique Dr. House's rebuttal testimony concerning his high-end estimate of second point water use. Is that right?
That's correct. Again, just to be clear for the record, from an historical perspective.
Understood. Ms. Mullen, can you please scroll down to the next page? And in the last sentence on lines 5 through 6, you critique Dr. House as not consulting the historical record to test the verisimilitude of his estimate of of 1914 era appropriations, correct?
Specifically, his wet year appropriation range under the second point, right?
What do you mean by the verisimilitude of that range?
The idea I was getting at was that Dr. House does not appear to have consulted the historical record to test what the evidence of the time, the primary source evidence, might reveal or suggest about the figures that he was calculating.
And you're not qualified to assess the technical quality of Dr. Howe's analysis, correct?
That's correct. And I think I've testified that in some detail. My point again is merely that Dr. House didn't wrestle with this historical evidence in his technical analysis.
Okay. And you specifically cite the years 1906 and 1916 as a basis for your critique. Is that right?
I do discuss those. I believe Dr. House has identified those as well.
Is your critique based on the Hammett reports calculations for those years?
Well, my critique, as I think I go into some detail in this section of my testimony, is based upon Hammett's calculation, other sources that indicate high flows in this time that reached Tulare Lake. Bulletin 9 similarly does a calculation indicating that flows in excess of 300,000 acre feet would be too uncertain to rely upon. So it's not just Hammett, but rather a lot of different sources that I think point to these 2 years in particular as years in which there was some quantity of water that could not be applied or wasn't applied south of Wasco Road, but was instead flowed all the way to Tulare Lake.
And Miller and Lux had over 50,000 acres of land north of Wasco Road as of 1914, correct?
I think the exact numbers escape me. And I think, again, we have to be careful about what we're talking about, lands north of Wasco Road. There's a lot of Miller and Lux property, one could say, north of Wasco Road.
Okay. The numbers you recite on your testimony, line 1 in paragraph 54 here, those numbers, do you know whether they reflect the Miller-Hagan Agreement's March through August allocation of water?
Sorry, Mr. Becerra, my screen was, my view of the images is blocking. What were the specific lines?
I'll try to cut through this. So on lines 1 and 4, you cite specific quantities by acre foot, correct?
Correct.
Do you know whether those numbers reflect the March through August allocation under the Miller-Hagan Agreement?
I believe they do. I would have to consult KWBA 16 or the Hammett report itself, because I believe he does identify that. So I think that's correct, but I'd want to verify by reference to the document.
Ms. Mullen, can we please pull up exhibit KWBA 16? And can we please go to PDF page 13?
Dr. Miltenberger, do you see the heading water supply on this page?
Yes, I do.
And Ms. Mullen, can we please scroll to the next page? And Dr. Miltenberger, does this page indicate that these numbers are the March through August allocation under the Miller-Hagan agreement?
Yes.
Do you know whether these calculations included any other water that Miller and Lux may have been entitled to as of 1914 under that agreement?
I can only rely, since we're talking specifically about this document, I can only rely what this document is identifying. And I think it's identifying that period in time as being the availability of the second point water.
Ms. Mullen, can we please go to PDF page 43 in this document? And you may need to blow it up so we can all see it. Thank you, Ms. Mullen. And I know we're asking a lot of you, Ms. Mullen, could you rotate it 90 degrees so we can see the table?
Excuse me, there is some kind of an alert that's happening in my, I don't know.
Let's go ahead and take just 1 minute. Go ahead,
Okay.
please, Dr.
Excuse me.
Miltenberger. This will also give a chance for Ms. Mullen to get us oriented here.
It appeared that in the conference room that I'm in, that there was perhaps an inadvertent call coming in. So that was a little distracting, and I would be certain that we were distracted. Excuse me.
It's fine. I think we worked it out. We also now I have the image a little bit blown up and at least oriented the right way. So I will turn this back to you, Mr. Becerra.
Okay, for purposes of the record, we're back on KWBA 16 and PDF page 43. Dr. Miltenberger, do you see that on this page, Mr. Hammett had certain projections for how Buena Vista might operate under 1906 conditions?
I do. I recognize this as what I would kind of understand as an operational analysis of within the confines of the district plan. It's at least one of three that I've seen in the historical record that Hammett prepared with different numbers for these different years, including 1906.
And Mr. Hammett's calculations for 1906 show no waste, correct?
Correct. Under the operational schema that he lays out in the district plan. As I also indicated, just for context, Ms. Kinsey, this is one of several that I've seen in the historical record I found in the course of my research with different numbers for these years.
And Dr. Miltenberger, specifically for 1906, Mr. Hammett shows that under those conditions, Buena Vista would accumulate approximately 200,000 acre feet of water in storage. Is that right?
May we blow that up, Ms. Mullen, please? I think it's probably the middle of the page at the top. Yeah, I see that he gives this value of 262,965 under the column net under the header to reservoir.
Do you see further to the right, the column, I believe it's in reservoir, end of month?
I think if we can scroll down just a little bit, please, Ms. Mullen. Oh, I'm sorry, scroll up. I want to see the top. There we go. Thank you.
Would you please re-ask your question, Mr. Becerra?
Sure. Do you see in the column labeled in reservoir end of month for 1906? The reservoir starts at 0 in January.
Yes.
And by, I believe it's June, the reservoir has about 200,000 acre feet of water in it. Do you see that?
Yes, that's the value given under this operational schema.
And then by December, it shows a value of about 132,000 acre feet. Is that right?
That's right.
And then by January of the following year, the total is about 126,000 acre feet.
Yes.
Do you know whether the Mr. Hammett projected that outside of the March through August months, Buena Vista would either need to use storage or groundwater to meet demands?
Yes, and I believe my case in chief testimony addressed that.
And so is this the kind of storage Mr. Hammett was projecting Buena Vista would need to use?
I think I would need to review in more depth because, of course, there's 2 units to the plan as he projects it. The second unit predicated on the development of Isabella, the Isabella Reservoir site.
As of 1927, when Hammett wrote this report, the only reservoir available was Buena Vista Lake Reservoir, correct?
Correct.
Ms. Mon, can we please go to page 44 of this report? And we'll have to, Ms. Mullen, if you could rotate that one, thank you. Read my mind. And Dr. Miltenberger, do you see Mr. Hammett's projections for conditions similar to 1909 on this page?
And sorry, I'm Dr. Miltenberger. I'm going to interpose an objection on grounds of relevance. I don't see what Hammett's projections have to do with Dr. Miltenberger's critique of Dr. Howe's about actual conditions in 1906, 1909, 1916.
Mr. Becerra, would you like to respond?
I believe Dr. Miltenberger testifies that he finds this report to be useful for understanding Miller and Lux's water use circa 1914.
And these tables do not refer to historical use. They are, as Dr. Miltenberger has testified, a projection of potential use under the plan described in the report.
Well, I'll take a detour, Ms. Kinsey.
Okay.
Ms. Mon, can we please pull up Dr. Miltenberger's testimony, KWBA 38? And go to page 22. And lines 14 through, or 10 through 14. Dr. Miltenberger, you specifically refer to the Hammett reports as having historical significance for Buena Vista's 1914 water right entitlement, correct?
That's a fair summary. With, of course, the understanding that as I elaborate in my testimony, the point I'm getting at is that Hammett identifies quantities of water that under the district plan would have greatly exceeded the needs of the district. And there's corroborating historical evidence that indicates that there was a large quantity of flow that passed beyond the limits of the district and entered Tulare Lake. And this is just evidence that Dr. Howes does not deal with.
Thank you, Dr. Miltenberger. I think that establishes the relevance of my questions.
Well, I'm sorry, but I have to disagree. What Dr. Miltenberger says in lines 16 through 18 of his testimony is that it sheds light on what the most knowledgeable person Miller and Lux's employee circa 1927 understood about the possible scope of the company's pre-1914 water use. These projections don't go to that and are not relevant to Dr. Miltenberger's opinions.
Ms. Kinsey, if I might.
You can have one more shot at it, Mr. Becerra.
We've been presented with this report. Dr. Miltenberger says it reflects his understanding of the possible scope of pre-1914 water use. I think I'm entitled to ask questions along that line.
And Mr. Bivens, do you have any final response?
Yeah, the projections don't reflect the scope of the company's pre-1914 water use. They reflect the potential scope of what could have been if the district plan was being implemented.
I'll go ahead and make the ruling. I'm going to allow this line of questioning. I do think that there's potential relevance here, and my understanding, of course, when I fully weigh all of the evidence, I will read this very carefully, but my understanding is that Dr. Miltenberger has himself established the potential relevance of the Hammett analysis to the scope of pre-14 water use. So I'm going to allow you to continue, Mr. Becerra.
Thank you. Ms. Mon, can we please go to PDF 24 in exhibit KWBA 38? And can we please, yes, thank you. Dr. Miltenberger, on lines 10 through 14, you describe how Mr. Hammett projected Buena Vista would have to use stored water or groundwater in some months of many years, correct?
When the second point water deliveries weren't adequate.
In that statement, are you referring strictly to the March through August allocation under the agreement?
Well, I'm relying on Hammett's discussion here, where that's where he's utilizing the agreement, as I understand it, as the basis for the calculations of what was available at second point.
Is a water use analysis of conditions circa 1914 that includes no water accumulating in storage consistent with the Hammett report?
Objection, vague and ambiguous.
Sustained. I didn't understand the question myself. So please try again, Mr. Becerra.
The Hammett report projected that Buena Vista would accumulate water in storage, as we've discussed, correct?
Hammett presents an operational analysis that under the district plan, according to those tables, would permit that storage.
And you find Mr. Hammett's report.
Actually, I'm sorry, I would just be clear. Again, that's not a description of the reality. And in fact, that's why I look to other corroborating evidence to demonstrate that is not in fact what occurred.
And you find Mr. Hammett's analysis to be useful to understand, quote, the possible scope of the company's pre-1914 water use, unquote, correct?
I indicate that it sheds light.
Would a analysis of water use to serve Buena Vista's service area circa 1914 that shows no accumulation of storage be consistent with Mr. Hammett's analysis?
Well, I actually think that we're getting into an area here that would really require a technical expert to assess. My once again, my point here is that there is import to this document. There is import to these figures. And it's not isolated what Hammett is doing when he calls out 1906 and 1916 in particular as years in which water would have been wasted. Or excuse me, he says specifically would have greatly exceeded the needs of the district. I think that kind of analysis is exactly the point of my critique of Dr. Howes, that he did not, I don't see that in his work, that he engaged with this historical evidence at the level that we are engaging with in these questions.
And Mr. Hammett's analysis showed Buena Vista accumulating water in storage in conditions like 1906 and 1909, correct?
Within the operational parameters described in the district plan.
And did Buena Vista Lake Reservoir exist in 1906 and 1909?
It did, and we have historical evidence that there was large quantities of water that were in excess of the reservoir and in excess of the district's use that passed north of Wasco Road in 1906 and 1916, waters that entered Tulare Lake.
And in those years, we have evidence that Miller and Lux accumulated water into storage in Buena Vista Lake Reservoir?
Given my knowledge of how they manage those flows, there seems likely that there would have been accumulated water. But again, Hammett, knowing the system, is still identifying quantities that would have exceeded that, quantities of water that would have gone past Wasco Road. Mr. Hammett was well aware.
You know whether
Hang on.
I'm sorry.
Excuse me. I was just to round out my answer. Mr. Hammett was well aware of the reservoir. I come back to the point that he's still calling out these years as years in which water would have been exceeded the needs of the district.
You know whether Dr. Davids included any component of accumulation of water in storage as part of his analysis of theoretical diversions as of 1914?
I think I'm only familiar with Dr. David's work at a general level. I think it's a question best asked of him.
Thank you. Ms. Mon, can we please go back to exhibit KWBA 16? And go to page 14, please. And can we please scroll down to the last paragraph? Yes. Dr. Miltenberger, do you see that this is referring to the Miller-Hagen agreement?
Yes.
And do you see it's referring to only the allocation from March through August?
Yes.
Do you know whether as of 1914, Miller and Lux had any other right under the Miller-Hagen agreement to divert water?
I would have to review the agreement in more detail. And I want to be careful, as I've tried to be careful throughout this, to describe it as an entitlement, not a right, so as to avoid giving a legal opinion. I'd also be cautious actually about reading, my reading of the Miller-Hagen agreement would be within an historical context and as an historian, not parsing its language as an attorney or a legal scholar might.
Can we, Ms. Mullen, can we please pull up exhibit North Kern 35? Dr. Miltenberger, do you recognize this document as the 1888 Miller-Hagen Agreement?
Yes,
Do you find this agreement to be significant in assessing Buena Vista's pre-1914 water right entitlement?
I think it's an important document among several.
Ms. Mullen, can we please go to PDF page 11, which is document page 10? Dr. Miltenberger, do you see that this is the third section of the agreement?
Yes,
Have you ever reviewed this third section of the agreement?
I have. It has been some time since I acquainted myself with its details.
Do you understand that it states the March through August allocation to second point water users that Mr. Hammett discussed?
Yes,
Ms. Mullen, can we please go to the next page, PDF page 12? Dr. Miltenberger, on the fourth line, do you see the sentence that starts any and all water?
yes,
Do you understand that sentence to authorize Miller and Lux to divert, quote, water, or let me start over. Sorry about that. Do you understand that sentence to state that the parties of the first part could divert any water that the parties of the second part were entitled to that did reach second point of measurement?
would you please repeat the question? I wanted to make certain I read the sentence in full.
That sentence that begins any and all water, do you understand it to authorize the parties of the first part to use water that the parties of the second part didn't use that reached second point of measurement?
I mean, I want to be careful about authorize in as much as I feel like that might carry some legal import, but I take the meaning as it is on the page.
Do you know whether as of 1914, Miller and Lux owned the vast majority of the second point right?
Yes,
And that would have included whatever entitlement this sentence beginning any and all water included, correct?
I suppose generally speaking, without access to the specifics of it.
By 1927, the state engineer had already rejected one proposal by Mr. Hammett to form Buena Vista. Is that right?
Well, I believe the petition wasn't by Hammett, but it was a petition involving several of the parties, including Miller and Lux.
And by 1927, the state engineer had rejected that initial petition, correct?
Correct.
And that was in part because the water supplies weren't reliable enough to serve that broader proposal. Is that accurate?
Yes, in part. Again, the other part being the soils issues in north of Wasco Road.
Is it possible Mr. Hammett didn't include this any and all water we've discussed in the Miller-Hagen agreement in the Hammett report because it wasn't reliable as of 1927?
Could you ask the question one more time? I want to be certain I've got it.
No, I'll break it up. as of 1927, the First Point water users could have just diverted this any and all water stated on page 11 of the Miller-Hagen agreement, correct?
I'm a little hesitant to get to opine on that because I didn't really study any First Point water users.
Have you studied the Miller-Hagen agreement and expressing opinions about pre-1914 water rights on the Kern River?
I have, as I testified previously, I reviewed this document.
And this sentence on page 11 about any and all water that was not diverted before it reached Second Point, have you studied that and expressing opinions about Second Point right?
Well, as I think I testified, again, I reviewed this document. I didn't review it with these particulars for the purposes of this rebuttal testimony. And I take the meaning as it appears on the page. But as far as the conduct and the actual practices of First Point water users, I didn't study it. So my hesitation is offering an opinion on what their actions may or may not have been.
Do you know whether Buena Vista's right to divert this water in addition to the March through August allocation was formalized after 1927?
Once again, I'm more comfortable speaking about entitlement rather than right. And as I sit here, I do recall that the Miller-Hagen agreement was revised subsequently.
Do you know whether the 1964 amendment to the Miller-Hagen agreement formalized Buena Vista's entitlement to water in addition to the March through August allocation?
I would have to examine it to be sure.
Okay, thank you.
And I suppose, again, speaking within the confines of my expertise, I'd want to be careful about jumping from 1888 to 1964 without being really attentive to the historical events that led or between those and developments in and around those dates, very specific issues regarding many of these agreements. As I recall, that 64 agreement was largely in the context of the Isabella negotiations. There's a lot of issues. I would be very hesitant as a historian to simply jump from 1888 to 1964 without that careful attention to that sequence of events, that history, the intervening history in between.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, can we please go back to the Hammett report, exhibit KWBA 16? And page 46. And I want to look at 1916 here. Dr. Miltenberger, do you see that Mr. Hammett's projections for operations in 1916 conditions show the reservoir filling to 209,000 acre feet in that year?
Yes, I see that for, looks like a run of 3 months.
Do you know whether 209,000 acre feet was the maximum capacity of Buena Vista Lake Reservoir as of 1927?
Mr. Hammett gives that as his capacity in the district plan.
And Mr. Hammett shows in the waste column about 110,000 acre feet for 1916 conditions. Is that right?
Cumulative, yes.
Do you know whether that's the only year in his series of projections where he shows any numbers in that waste column?
That's my recollection.
And those numbers in the waste column for 1916, those occur in months when the reservoir is at maximum capacity. Is that right?
That's what appears from this operational projection, yes.
And at that point, the water would have flowed down the flood channel canal towards Tulare Lake. Is that accurate?
If it were released from, well, I mean, I suppose it depends. I mean, there were multiple points where the waters would have been discharged north of Wasco Road. The flood channel was the principal one.
Can we, Ms. Mullen, can we please go to Dr. Miltenberger's testimony, exhibit KWBA 38? And go to page 31, please, and footnote 47. And consistent with what you just said, in footnote 47, you indicate that water would have flowed down the flood channel canal north of Wasco Road. Is that accurate?
Yes, with the flood channel terminating at Wasco Road, yes.
Ms. Mullen, can we please go to PDF page 30 of this exhibit, paragraph 63? And Dr. Miltenberger, in this paragraph, you describe how the Lippincott Means Report indicated Miller and Lux was using lands north of Wasco Road. Is that right?
That's correct.
And at least as of the 1919 report, Miller and Lux was using those lands for grazing. Is that right?
That's according to Thomas Means, yes.
And your opinion it is that as of this time, Miller and Lux was primarily a livestock and meat packing operation. Is that right?
That's correct.
So grazing lands would have been important to Miller and Lux as of 1919. Is that fair to say?
Grazing lands in a number of locations would have been important to them, yes.
Is it fair to say that the water supplies for the grazing lands north of Wasco Road as of 1919 would have been high flows out of the Kern River?
Well, I think the historical record's pretty clear that those lands were watered by those high flows.
And Ms. Mullen, can we please go to PDF page 33 and paragraph 67? I think it's the next page. In that paragraph, you summarize a discussion by Mr. Hammett of water use north of Wasco Road circa 1922. Is that right?
Yes.
And as of that time, Mr. Hammett described how water was actually being diverted out of canals for grazing purposes. Is that accurate?
Well, I note that he identifies those lands at present being used for grazing purposes only. And he notes that water was diverted out of the natural sloughs in the area.
So is it fair to say as of 1922, water would flow out of the flood channel canal and then potentially into natural sloughs north of Wasco Road?
Yes.
And then it was diverted out of those sloughs to support grazing north of Wasco Road. Is that accurate?
When the water was there and available. And of course, we have other evidence that suggests that these conditions were very different than, these irrigation conditions were very different than they were south of Wasco Road.
Understood. In your opinion, does the historical record show that Miller and Lux was using high Kern River flows to irrigate grazing lands north of Wasco Road circa 1914?
Well, I would with specific reference in 1906, where we know that there is a large amount of water that came into Tulare Lake. I note that newspaper reporting suggests that that was really unregulated flow, unregulated, excuse me, it was uncontrolled, that there was, and it did a considerable amount of damage on its way to Tulare Lake. And in fact, I think that there's some suggestion that it almost created a lake of its own, or that there was a lake that extended sort of northward. I'm not certain if that's irrigation in the same way that we have evidence sort of south of Wasco Road for irrigation.
But the historical record indicates Miller and Lux was relying on those kinds of high flows to support grazing north of Wasco Road. Is that right?
I think I would characterize it a little more this way. It seemed more advantageous than planned or intended, given the fact that other elements of the historical record indicate how difficult it was to get water that far downstream or northward. I mean, even within lands south of Wasco Road.
And in paragraph 67 of your testimony, you describe how Mr. Hammett described how water was diverted north of Wasco Road. Is that right?
Well, I think as I testified, what I focused on was that there was water taken out of natural sloughs.
Can we please pull up Dr. House's PowerPoint exhibit KWBA 57 and go to slide 6?
And maybe while we're doing that, Mr. Becerra, can you give me an estimate of how much additional cross-exam you have for Dr. Miltenberger?
About 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
And can we please go to page 6? And in your left box there on slide 6, Dr. Miltenberger, you identify how Mr. Means described how lands north of Wasco Road were being irrigated by wild flooding for grazing. Is that right?
Actually, I think he doesn't actually use the word irrigation. He says the water having been provided by wild flooding, which I think of as something very distinctly different than water delivered into contour checks or other sort of formal irrigation structures.
Okay. So in that left box, you identify Miller and Lux relying on wild flooding to water grazing lands north of Wasco Road. Is that right?
They utilize that water under wild flooding at seasons of abundant supply, water supply.
To the best of your knowledge, has any witness of Kern Water Bank Authority presented any evidence of how much water grazing lands north of Wasco Road required as of 1914?
Objection. I think the record speaks for itself in terms of what the Kern Water Bank Authority's witnesses have submitted.
Overruled. I'm going to allow the question, although Mr. Becerra, will you repeat? I think I'm going to allow the question. Will you repeat it one more time to make sure? I was wondering whether you asked this question of Dr. Miltenberger's knowledge, which of course would be, he'd be limited to his own experience and understanding. So please try it again.
Dr. Miltenberger, to the best of your knowledge, has any witness of Kern Water Bank Authority presented any evidence to estimate the water demands of Miller and Lux's grazing lands north of Wasco Road circa 1914?
I'm not as familiar with the other experts' testimony as I am in my own. So I don't know as I sit here.
Thank you. Ms. Kinsey, that's completes my cross-examination of Dr. Miltenberger.
All right, thank you, Mr. Becerra. With that, I'll look to the larger room to see if is there anyone else who is going to have cross-examination questions for Dr. Miltenberger? And then, Mr. Bivens, do you anticipate that you will have redirect for Dr. Miltenberger?
I do, but I think it'll be very brief. And if we take a 5-minute break, we can get it done before our lunch hour, I would imagine.
Okay. Then let's go ahead and do that. We'll take a 5-minute break and we'll reconvene and hopefully get through Dr. Miltenberger's testimony so that he can depart for the day. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's return at 11:50. All right, let's go back on the record. It looks to me we have Mr. Becerra, Dr. Miltenberger, and Mr. Bivens. And just to be clear, I don't have any additional questions for Dr. Miltenberger at this time. So with that, I will turn to you, Mr. Bivens. Do you have redirect for Dr. Miltenberger?
I do, Ms. Kenzie, thank you.
Please go ahead.
Dr. Miltenberger, do you recall Mr. Becerra asking you some questions on cross about alfalfa yield data in the Buena Vista Water Storage District reported by WP Stanton?
I do.
In your opinion as an historian, are there any reasons to be skeptical about the alfalfa yield data that was reported?
Well, within the context of the Stanton report itself, Stanton expressed a lack of confidence in the yield data numbers specifically for alfalfa when reviewing those reports that Buena Vista provided. He also discussed a number of other factors that could potentially account for those high numbers, not the least of which being more extensive groundwater development that coincided with, I think in his words, years of full supply starting in the mid to late 1930s. He also identifies land leveling as a sort of a necessary prerequisite to improvements that would facilitate more productive agricultural yields. And then there's a whole sort of reorientation of the land from this grain and pasture basis that Miller and Lux, grain and pasture is Stanton's words, pasture basis within the area to small individual farmers who are cultivating crops for local markets or more local markets, all of which could account, I think Ken suggests or provides those as reasons potentially to think that, to explain those numbers.
And based on your review of Dr. Howe's surrebuttal testimony, or I'm sorry, based on your review of Dr. Howe's rebuttal testimony, did he engage or grapple with any of those factors in his discussion of the Stanton data?
No.
Objection beyond the scope of Dr. Miltenberger's qualifications.
I just asked whether it appeared that Dr. Howe's grappled with those historical factors, and I think Dr. Miltenberger is entitled to read the report and opine on whether historical factors were grappled with from his position as an historian.
Mr. Becerra, do you have anything else to say about your objection?
I mean, Dr. Howes would have looked at these things technically. Dr. Miltenberger does not. The concept of whether he grappled with some document or not is not overly relevant to what Dr. Howes' technical analysis does.
Can I respond to that?
No, let's stop. I'm going to overrule the objection and leave the response, the answer in the record, with the caveat that I will consider this objection in the context of weighing the evidentiary value of that response. So let's go ahead and move on, Mr. Bivens.
That is all I have for redirect, Ms. Kenzie.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Becerra, do you have, based on that limited redirect, do you have recross for Dr. Miltenberger?
Very briefly.
Okay, please go ahead.
Ms. Mon, can we please pull up Dr. Miltenberger's case in chief testimony, exhibit KWBA 1? And can we please go to page 44, paragraph 63. Dr. Miltenberger, beginning at paragraph 63 and continuing through paragraph 67, you discussed the Stanton report. Is that right?
Ms. Mullen, we continue to scroll down. Mr. Becerra, had you asked me about paragraph 63 to 67.
67, correct.
Okay, maybe we continue to scroll down, Ms. Mullen. I've reviewed it. I can see that. Yes.
In those paragraphs, do you discuss Mr. Stanton identifying any skepticism he had about the alfalfa crop yields?
I don't, but that also wasn't the focus of my discussion.
Thank you. That's all I have, Ms. Kinsey.
Thank you, Mr. Becerra. And I think with that, we've completed Dr. Miltenberger's rebuttal testimony. So I will turn to you, Dr. Miltenberger. Thank you for joining us once again. It's good to see you.
Thank you.
And you are excused for the day before lunch. So thank you very much. Turning to our schedule, I believe where we pick up next is with presentation of a summary of testimony by Dr. Davids. It is now 11:57, so it seems an obvious place to break for lunch for an hour. But before we do that, is there anything that we should address before breaking for lunch? All right, it is close enough to noon, so let's go ahead and break for lunch until 1 p.m. and then we will pick up with testimony from Dr. Davids. Thank you very much. Oh, and please, I'm sorry, please log in and out. You will be booted out of the Zoom, but you will need to log in and out. If you haven't recall, we do that every time. So I will see you on the other side of the Zoom. Thank you.
Thank you.